Harvard University, a name that conjures prestige, power, and secrecy. Behind its storied gates lies a world few ever truly understand. A world of ambition, intellect, and, on a bitter January morning in 1969, something far darker. It was supposed to be just another snowy Monday in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Students bundled in coats shuffled between lectures. Professors sipped coffee behind thick-paned office windows. But as the sun rose over the icy Charles River, it cast light on something unthinkable, something the Ivy League had never seen before. 23-year-old Jane Britton, an accomplished graduate student in anthropology, was found dead in her apartment just a stone's throw from Harvard's prestigious Peabody Museum. Murdered in the dead of night, bludgeoned, her body covered in red ochre, a powder associated with ancient burial rituals. It was horrifying, it was bizarre, and it didn't fit the picture-perfect image of Harvard at all. But Jane Britton was not just any student. She was brilliant, outspoken, known for her wit, her curiosity, and her relentless drive to uncover the mysteries of human civilization. Now she had become one. Who could have done this? A jealous academic rival? A deranged stranger? Or someone inside the very institution she trusted? As the media frenzy erupted and police swarmed the campus, Harvard closed ranks. The administration offered little. Professors clammed up. Students whispered in hallways. A veil of silence descended over Cambridge. And so, the mystery began. A case that would baffle police, enrage the public, and haunt Harvard for decades. This is the story of Jane Britton, the girl who uncovered secrets of the past until she became one. January 7th, 1969. The chill of winter blanketed Cambridge, Massachusetts, and the Harvard campus pulsed with the quiet urgency of students returning from the holiday break. But for one student, Jane Britton, the new year would never begin. She didn't show up for her scheduled exam. That wasn't like Jane. Not at all. She was punctual, dependable, the kind of student who treated academic commitments like gospel. Her boyfriend, James Humphreys, was the first to notice something was wrong. They had spoken the night before, had dinner together, even discussed her upcoming exams. Jane was cheerful, engaged. There was no indication of anything being off. But now it was almost noon. Jane hadn't turned up. She hadn't called. And she wasn't answering her phone. Humphreys grew concerned. He made his way to her apartment, a fourth-floor walk-up at 6 University Road, just outside Harvard Yard, nestled in the heart of Harvard Square. A building filled with graduate students and young professionals. A place where you were supposed to feel safe. The door was locked. Strange. He knocked. No answer. That's when he called for help from Jane's neighbors, including a fellow Harvard student named Donald Mitchell, and eventually the building's superintendent. They unlocked the door, and what they found inside would send shockwaves across the city. The scene was surreal. Jane Britton was lying face up on her bed, wearing a nightgown. Her body was partially covered with a fur coat and a rug. Her legs hung off the edge of the mattress, dangling limply toward the floor. Blood spattered across the sheets, soaked into the pillow. It was clear, immediately horrifyingly, that Jane was dead. Someone had murdered her, brutally. The killer had struck her multiple times in the head with a blunt object. The autopsy would later reveal that the cause of death was multiple blunt force trauma injuries to the skull. It wasn't quick. It wasn't merciful. It was rage. Panic swept through the apartment. The neighbors backed away. The room, now eerily quiet, felt like a crime scene frozen in time. And yet, there were signs that suggested something even more chilling. This wasn't just a random act of violence. The arrangement of the body, the objects placed around her, the fur coat draped with almost ritualistic precision. There was speculation, whispered among students and later printed in headlines, that it might have been part of an ancient Mesopotamian burial ritual, a nod to Jane's field of study. But was that true? Or was it a gruesome coincidence? Police arrived at the scene. So did Harvard officials. And the media? They swarmed. Jane wasn't just any student. She was brilliant, prominent, the daughter of a Harvard-associated anthropologist, This was a headline that wrote itself. Harvard co-ed slain in ritualistic killing. The room bore no signs of forced entry. No broken windows. No splintered locks. It was as if Jane had known her killer or trusted them enough to let them in. Her purse was missing. Her underwear had been taken. There were faint signs of sexual assault, but tests in 1969 were limited. The medical examiner could not conclusively determine if she had been raped. But the implication was there. The fear, the horror. Detectives scrambled to piece together her final moments. What time had she come home? Had anyone seen her that night? Witnesses confirmed. Jane had been out with Humphreys until about 8:30 p.m. They had dinner, went ice skating. They parted ways, and she walked back to her apartment. She was seen around 8:45 p.m. by a neighbor. That was the last time anyone saw Jane Britton alive. Her apartment was secured, evidence collected, but the scene was frustratingly clean. There were no fingerprints, no signs of forced entry, no weapon found. And then the whispers began. Jane had confided in friends about a strange man, someone who had followed her once, someone who watched her window from the street below. She had mentioned a creeping sense of being surveilled, stalked. Had he come back? Police canvassed the area, talked to students, to faculty, to friends, but no suspect emerged. There were rumors fueled by campus gossip and media frenzy. Some believed it was a jealous lover, others a deranged professor, and then there were those who insisted it was someone from Jane's archaeology circle, someone who wanted her silenced. Investigators found traces of red ochre in the apartment, an earthy pigment used in ancient burials, including those Jane had studied. But was it symbolic, or just academic residue? The press ran wild with theories. Harvard students slain in Mesopotamian rite. Ancient rituals haunt modern campus. The story was everywhere. But answers? Those were in short supply. Days turned into weeks. The semester moved on. But Jane's memory hung over the university like a ghost. Her professors were shaken. Her classmates traumatized. A security panic surged across Harvard Yard. Curfews were enacted. Locks were reinforced. Students whispered warnings in dorm halls. Don't walk alone. Don't open your door to strangers. Remember Jane. She had been on the brink of brilliance. A rising star. A gifted archaeologist, fluent in ancient languages, with a sharp mind and a warm smile. Her death wasn't just tragic. It was senseless. But perhaps the most haunting detail? Jane Britton was killed in a place she should have been safest. Her own bed, in a building full of neighbors, friends, and academics. In the heart of Harvard, with the world ahead of her. And yet, the deeper police dug, the darker the shadows became. Because in Cambridge, where intellect reigned and secrets slept beneath ivy-covered walls, Jane's murder wasn't just a crime. It was a riddle, one that would remain unsolved for nearly 50 years. The death of Jane Britton did more than just end a life. It cracked the very foundation of Harvard University, an institution steeped in tradition, cloaked in prestige, and now trembling beneath the weight of fear. The halls of academia, once bustling with optimism and intellectual curiosity, were now stalked by silence and suspicion. Students no longer walked freely through Harvard Yard at night. They huddled in groups. They double-locked their doors. Conversations shifted from research and exams to murder, fear, and the haunting question echoing through every dormitory. Who killed Jane Britton? This wasn't supposed to happen here. Harvard, one of the most respected and secure universities in the country, had a reputation to uphold. A murder on campus? That was a threat not just to student safety, but to the very brand of the Ivy League. And so, the university's response was swift, but calculated. They increased security, hired additional campus patrols, announced changes to student housing. But behind the scenes, whispers circulated that something was being buried, something deeper than a body. A scandal, a failure, a cover-up. The Cambridge police, led by Detective Joseph McLaughlin, were in over their heads. This wasn't an alleyway homicide. This was the elite inner circle of Harvard academia. The victim wasn't a nameless stranger. She was Jane Britton, well-known, connected, and beloved. The press swarmed the investigation, turning Harvard Square into a media circus. Headlines screamed across Boston and New York. Harvard co-ed slain in ritual killing. Murder in the Ivory Tower. Who is the Harvard killer? Reporters camped outside Jane's building. They hounded classmates, professors, even her grieving parents. The story had everything the media craved: beauty, brains, blood, and a mystery too tangled to ignore. Inside the university, the archaeology department, a once respected enclave of ancient studies, was now a vortex of suspicion. Faculty meetings turned cold. Trust eroded. Colleagues looked over their shoulders, wondering if the killer sat beside them in lectures or faculty lounges. It didn't help that Jane had been working closely with some of the most influential minds in the field. Scholars like Dr. C.C. Lambert-Karlofsky and Dr. Stephen Williams, men whose reputations spanned continents, men who were suddenly being scrutinized not for their research, but for their whereabouts. Still, police had nothing. No fingerprints, no murder weapon, no concrete suspect, and no motive that made any sense. Was it personal? Professional? Sexual? Was it jealousy? Rage? Or something far more sinister? Detectives combed through Jane's academic life. Every thesis draft, every note, every personal journal. They questioned her classmates, her roommates, her ex-boyfriends. They built timelines, dredged up grudges. Even the most minor disagreements became potential motives. Then came a strange twist, one that turned rumor into paranoia. In the weeks before her death, Jane had allegedly told friends about a man watching her, lurking. She believed someone was outside her window, night after night, just staring. She wasn't paranoid. She told them he was real. She felt watched, stalked. The police took it seriously, but no one could identify the man. No one ever saw him. There were no footprints in the snow, no strange visitors to the building. The stalker theory became just another dead end. Until they found the fire escape, investigators discovered that Jane's killer had likely entered her apartment through the fire escape outside her bedroom window. The window had been slightly ajar. No sign of forced entry. But here's what made it chilling. Someone had come up that escape route before. In the weeks prior, Jane had reportedly heard footsteps outside her window on the metal stairs. But she thought it was just a neighbor. Maybe a cat. Now, that sound had a face. A murderer's face. Someone had scaled 4 stories in the dead of night, slipped through the window, and murdered her just feet away from where the rest of the building slept. The message was clear: no one was safe. Harvard tried to calm the storm. They issued statements, promised cooperation with law enforcement. But the truth was obvious. There was a predator loose, and no one had answers. Female students were terrified. Some dropped out. Some transferred. Parents flooded the administration with letters demanding protection for their daughters. Police patrols doubled. Locks were reinforced. Window alarms were installed. But the damage was done. Cambridge, once a city of scholars, now bore the scars of fear. And in the center of it all was Jane Britton. She had been murdered in her own bed, in a building full of students, and no one had seen or heard a thing. The crime scene was quiet. Too quiet. Jane's body had been deliberately posed. Her legs dangled off the bed. Her nightgown was bloodied. A fur coat lay across her chest, almost reverently. And then the rug wrapped around her like a shroud. It was eerie, chilling, intentional. Police didn't know what to make of it. Was the killer toying with them? Sending a message? Or was this part of some ancient ritual? That's when the red ochre was discovered. Powdered pigment often used in prehistoric burial sites, including ones Jane had studied extensively. Reporters seized the narrative. Murder imitates ancient ritual. Archaeologists slain in own research. But experts pushed back. There was no clear indication the killer knew anything about Mesopotamian burial practices. And the ochre? It could have simply been dust from one of Jane's dig kits. A coincidence. Nothing more. Still, the media didn't care. And neither did the public. The story had grown legs. And now it had its own mythology. Jane's murder became more than just a homicide. It became folklore, a modern Gothic tale whispered through ivy-covered walls. A ghost story passed down from generation to generation of Harvard students. But the detectives? They were out of leads. They questioned dozens of people, polygraphed friends, analyzed hair samples, consulted forensic experts. But again and again they hit walls. The killer had left no prints, no usable DNA, nothing to tie them to the scene. And with every day that passed, Jane's case grew colder. The university returned to business as usual. Class schedules resumed. Exams were held. Lectures continued. But the shadows lingered. A plaque honoring Jane's academic contributions was placed in the anthropology building. Her thesis, unfinished, was awarded posthumously. But behind every tribute was an unanswered question. Why? Why Jane? Why that night? Why that brutality? And most of all, why did the killer never strike again? Was it a crime of passion? A one-time eruption? Or had the murderer simply disappeared? The students never forgot. Even decades later, Jane's story would be retold to every incoming class. A cautionary tale, a mystery that became part of Harvard's unofficial history. But what no one knew, what no one could have imagined, was that the killer's identity had been hiding in plain sight. For decades, unseen, unmatched, unpunished, until technology finally caught up to evil. Winter crept back into Cambridge. Snow settled where fear once prowled. But the killer remained a ghost. Weeks passed, then months, then years. And in the chilling silence that followed Jane Britton's murder, something even more terrifying began to set in, forgetting. The headlines faded. Reporters moved on. Other tragedies took center stage. What was once a media frenzy became yesterday's story. The buzz that filled the Harvard halls in January of 1969 dissolved into whispered speculation, then bitter silence. But for the people who knew her, for her family, her friends, and a handful of investigators, the nightmare never ended. Jane was gone, and no one had been held accountable. The case files ballooned. Evidence was boxed and stored. Suspects came and went. Dozens were questioned. A handful were polygraphed. Some even confessed to things they didn't do. But none of it stuck. None of it made sense. Police retraced Jane's steps over and over again, trying to fill in the blanks. The night before she died, she'd been out with her boyfriend, James Humphreys, a fellow anthropology student. They'd gone ice skating, had dinner, and parted ways around 8:30 p.m. By 10:30, Jane was back in her apartment. By 1:30 a.m., she was dead. A 4-hour window. That was all they had. And yet it led nowhere. The fire escape theory, promising at first, also hit a dead end. Yes, someone had likely entered through her window, but the metal showed no fingerprints, no signs of struggle, no DNA. And this was before modern forensics, before touch DNA, before crime scenes were preserved like sacred temples. Back then, they vacuumed the floor, tossed out bags of evidence, let officers stomp through crime scenes with muddy boots. They didn't know what they were losing, and by the time they did, it was already gone. The investigators kept looking, kept asking, but the trail grew colder every year. Jane's ex-boyfriends were cleared. Her professors had airtight alibis. Even James Humphreys, the boyfriend she'd kissed goodnight, just hours before she was killed, passed multiple polygraphs. There was no forced entry, no signs of sexual assault, no stolen property, only a brutal blow to the head and a strange theatrical crime scene. Her killer had used a blunt object, possibly a rock or a brick. Jane had died from massive cranial trauma, but the autopsy revealed something else. She had been surprised. There were no defensive wounds, no signs she tried to fight back. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't run. She was either asleep when the killer struck or she knew them. And that detail haunted everyone involved in the case. Because if Jane knew her killer, then it had to be someone close, a classmate, a friend, someone who could walk into her bedroom in the middle of the night and she wouldn't feel afraid. But that theory, too, collapsed under the weight of time. With no evidence and no leads, Police did what many departments eventually do when the answers won't come. They boxed it up, filed it away, and waited. Jane's parents never stopped asking questions. George and Ruth Britton turned their grief into a crusade. For years, they lobbied law enforcement, wrote letters, met with reporters, pushed for updates, but they grew older, and the answers never came. Eventually, the letters stopped. The meetings ended. Time, relentless and cruel, swept over them like snow on a forgotten sidewalk. George died in 2000. Ruth followed in 2006. They never learned who took their daughter's life. And Harvard? Harvard moved on. The students graduated. Professors retired. Buildings were renovated. Jane's name faded from course catalogs and department rosters. By the 1990s, her murder had become a whisper, a chilling anecdote for freshmen on campus tours, a name spoken late at night with the dorm room lights turned off. You know someone was murdered in this building, right? Yet, underneath all that forgetting, the case waited, unsolved, dormant, but not dead. In 2007, nearly 40 years after Jane was murdered, something unexpected happened. A Boston Globe reporter, Dugan Arnett, picked up the cold trail. Curious about the forgotten killing, he filed a Freedom of Information request to access the case file. A formality, he thought. Routine. But what came back was a wall of silence. The request was denied. Cambridge police claimed that the case was still active. Active? After 4 decades? That didn't sit right. Arnett kept digging. His story ran in 2007, and it reignited interest in the case. Suddenly, former students, professors, and even investigators started talking again. But still no answers. Narrator intensifying hopeful tone. It wasn't until 2017, almost 50 years after Jane's death, that her surviving family members demanded a new review. And this time, science was on their side, because the world had changed. And now, so had forensics. DNA technology, once the stuff of science fiction, was now standard. Cases from the 60s, 70s, even earlier were being solved across the country using tiny biological traces and genetic genealogy. If anything from Jane's crime scene had been preserved, there might be hope. And to everyone's surprise, something had been preserved. A small sample, a smear of biological material on Jane's clothing. Untested for decades, forgotten in a storage vault. In 2018, nearly 50 years after the murder, that sample was sent to a lab. And then, they found a match. Narrator, sharp shift, dramatic reveal tone. The man's name was Michael Sumter. He wasn't a professor. He wasn't a classmate. He wasn't part of Jane's life at all. In fact, Jane had likely never even met him. Because Michael Sumter wasn't from Harvard. He was a career criminal, a violent predator with a known history of assault and rape in the Boston area. And at the time of Jane Britton's murder, he lived just blocks away. Michael Sumter had already been convicted of multiple rapes in the 1970s. He had spent years in prison. He was considered so dangerous that he was constantly transferred between facilities to prevent escape. But here's the catch. He died in 2001, 16 years before police would link his DNA to the crime scene. Jane's killer had walked free for 32 years. And then he died before justice could ever be served. For the Britton family, it was a bittersweet ending. They finally had a name, a face, an answer, but no apology, no trial, no chance to confront the man who shattered their world. Michael Sumter had escaped justice, not in court, but in death. And yet, the truth mattered. For decades, people whispered about professors, accused boyfriends, suspected insiders. But in the end, it wasn't an Ivy League conspiracy. It wasn't a jealous lover. It was a stranger, an opportunist, a killer who slipped through an unlocked window and disappeared into the night. Narrator reflective, slower pacing. The revelation also forced law enforcement to rethink other cases. If Michael Sumter had killed Jane in 1969, what else had he done? How many others were never linked to his name? How many families were still waiting, still wondering, just like the Brittons? And how many Jane Brittons were out there, still unsolved? The case of Jane Britton remained open for nearly 50 years. But it wasn't just about the murder. It was about the silence that followed, the years of uncertainty, the fear, the gossip, the lies, and the truth that arrived too late. But even in death, Jane's story lived on. Because she wasn't just another victim. She was a scholar, a daughter, a dreamer, and finally she was remembered. The case had a name. The killer had a face. The truth had finally surfaced. But underneath that long-awaited resolution, a darker question lingered. Why did it take so long? Why did a brilliant young woman's murder, one that happened in the heart of Harvard, one that shocked the nation, go unsolved for nearly 50 years? The answer? Lies, fear, and silence. Because the story of Jane Britton isn't just about a murder. It's about what happens when secrets become survival and institutions protect themselves instead of the people within them. And as investigators began to revisit the decades-old crime with fresh eyes, they realized something terrifying. Harvard might have known more than it ever let on. Cut to 1969. In the wake of Jane's murder, Harvard scrambled to control the fallout. Administrators issued brief, carefully worded statements. They offered condolences to Jane's family, counseling to shaken students, security upgrades to reassure the community. But behind closed doors, they were panicking. A female graduate student had just been murdered in her apartment, a stone's throw from Harvard Yard. It wasn't just a tragedy, it was a PR nightmare. Harvard's reputation was at stake, and in the Ivy League, image is everything. According to former faculty members, students, and even law enforcement, the university clamped down hard. They discouraged speculation, discouraged interviews, discouraged questions. Whispers began to circulate through the anthropology department. Had Jane known too much? Had she angered someone? Had she uncovered something in her research? To the public, it sounded like paranoia, urban legend, the stuff of conspiracy theories. But to those on the inside, especially women in the department, it didn't feel far-fetched. Because long before the word feminism found traction on campus, women like Jane Britton were already fighting quiet battles behind the scenes. For recognition, for safety, for survival. In 1969, the anthropology department at Harvard was a fortress of tradition. Male-dominated, secretive, powerful. Female students often found themselves isolated, marginalized. Some even claimed they were openly discouraged from pursuing fieldwork, especially in remote or dangerous regions. Jane, however, pushed back. She wasn't just smart, she was fearless. She planned to do her dissertation research in Iran. She was already fluent in French. She could read Middle Persian. She climbed mountains, rode horses, lived for the unknown. And that boldness didn't always sit well with her professors. One faculty member, speaking anonymously years later, admitted that Jane was respected but not protected. She'd made waves in a place where waves weren't welcome. She stood out too much, and that fact lingered uncomfortably in the background of her case for decades. Because while police searched for a faceless intruder, some wondered if the danger had always been closer. There was also the matter of the crime scene. Jane's apartment had been the epicenter of the investigation. But the way it was handled raised serious questions. Her body had been discovered around 12:30 p.m. But by 2 p.m., multiple faculty members had already entered the apartment. Why? Who let them in? And what were they looking for? Some sources claimed they were identifying artifacts Jane had been working on. Others said they were there for emotional support. But skeptics argued something more sinister, that evidence might have been removed, that information might have been scrubbed, that someone didn't want certain things seen or known. And when you look at the facts, it's hard to dismiss those theories outright. One of Jane's professors, Karl Lambert-Karlofsky, had been an early person of interest, not because there was evidence of guilt, but because of proximity and a complicated dynamic. He was brilliant, respected, and known to be intense. He was also one of the first people to arrive at the crime scene. Years later, Lambert-Karlofsky would express bitterness about the cloud of suspicion that hovered over him for decades. But the fact that any professor had access to an active crime scene is shocking. Why were boundaries crossed? Why weren't protocols followed? And who was protecting whom? Because if this had happened at any other college, it might have been different. But this wasn't any college. It was Harvard. And Harvard doesn't air its dirty laundry. Jane's case also highlights a broader problem: how elite institutions deal with internal scandal. When something dark happens behind closed, ivy-covered walls, the reflex is almost always the same. Contain, control, protect the brand. Police departments, too, sometimes fall into this trap, especially when dealing with high-profile entities. The Cambridge police had jurisdiction over the case, but sources say they were cooperative with the university from the start. Some even claim there was pressure to avoid implicating anyone connected to the school. No bad press, no scandal, no truth. So, while Jane's friends grieved, while her family begged for answers, while the public moved on, the walls around her murder grew higher and thicker. Even when DNA evidence emerged decades later, Cambridge police were reluctant to name suspects until the lab results were ironclad. They knew what was at stake. Because what if, after all these years, the killer turned out to be someone with a Harvard tie? A professor? A student? A secret? That shadow lingered over the case for half a century. And through it all, Jane Britton's legacy became something different. Not just a symbol of violence, but a symbol of erasure, of how powerful systems forget the people they fail to protect, of how smart, capable women can be silenced not just by force, but by bureaucracy. But Jane didn't vanish. She didn't disappear into the footnotes of history. She remained, in stories, in suspicion, in the quiet activism of those who whispered her name long after others forgot it. Even the strange details of her murder felt symbolic. The red ochre sprinkled around her body, a ritualistic gesture seen in ancient burial rites. Was it staged? Was it real? Was her killer sending a message? To her? To Harvard? To all of us? We may never know. Because while we now have a name, Michael Sumter, we don't have his words. He never spoke about Jane, never confessed, never explained why. He died in 2001, taking his motives to the grave. And that's the cruelty of justice that arrives too late. You can identify the killer, but you can't confront them. You can solve the mystery, but you can't undo the silence. You can close the file, but you can't close the wound. The shadows that followed Jane Britton weren't just cast by her killer. They were cast by a system that didn't listen fast enough, didn't act boldly enough, didn't care loud enough. And while her story is no longer cold, it still burns with unanswered questions about power, about privilege, about what gets buried and what refuses to stay hidden. Because sometimes the darkest part of a crime isn't the murder, it's the silence that follows. Time is supposed to dull the edges of pain, blur the outlines of tragedy. But for Jane Britton, time did something different. It sharpened the mystery, it amplified the silence, and it left behind an echo, one that haunted every hallway, every whisper, every dusty box of unsolved files that sat in the archives of Cambridge Police and Harvard University. Because as the decades passed, one question refused to fade. How does a murder like Jane's go unanswered for so long? And when the answer finally came, it wasn't through confession or a tip or a moment of remorse. It came from the past itself, DNA evidence, like a ghost reaching up from the grave to whisper, "I was always here." It had been nearly 48 years. Jane's parents had long since passed. Her friends had moved on, carrying their grief like a scar buried beneath everyday life. The case had become the stuff of local lore, whispers of an Ivy League murder, a promising student silenced, a killer never caught. But in 2017, the cold case unit of the Middlesex District Attorney's Office decided to take a fresh look. Not out of a tip, not because of new leads, but because of technology. You see, in 1969, the science of forensics was primitive. There were no DNA profiles, no Cody's database, no rapid sequencing. But now, a single hair, a drop of blood, The faintest trace of skin cells could unlock the truth. Investigators pulled the old evidence out of storage, and what they found shocked them. The integrity of the sample was intact. There was still usable DNA, a miracle. And when that sample was run through the National DNA Database, it hit. The match? Michael Sumter, a name no one in Jane's orbit recognized, a name that had never surfaced in the original investigation, but one that had a chilling past, because Michael Sumter was no stranger to violence. Born in 1947, Michael Sumter grew up in Boston. On the surface, he was just another face in the crowd, working odd jobs, living in public housing, in and out of trouble. But beneath that exterior was a predator. Between 1975 and 1978, he raped and terrorized multiple women across the greater Boston area. He had a specific pattern. He targeted women who lived alone. He forced his way in. He struck them, raped them, then vanished. Cold, calculated, cruel. He was finally caught in 1975 and convicted of multiple assaults. But Jane's murder? That was 6 years earlier. And back in 1969, no one had even heard of him. He wasn't on the police radar. He had no known ties to Harvard. But the DNA didn't lie. Not only did Sumter's DNA match the sample taken from Jane's body, it also matched DNA in 2 other unsolved sexual assault cases from the same era. Suddenly, a terrifying pattern emerged. Michael Sumter was a serial predator, a man who slipped through the cracks, and Jane Britton, brilliant, curious, unsuspecting, had been one of his earliest victims. But here's where the story gets even darker. Michael Sumter died in 2001 from cancer. He was never interviewed, never charged in Jane's case, never forced to explain why. The closest anyone came to answers was through his widow. When contacted by investigators in 2018, she admitted something chilling, that Sumter had once lived near Harvard Square, just a 15-minute walk from Jane's apartment, that he was familiar with the area, and that he had confessed to bad things in his past, things he refused to elaborate on. She didn't know about Jane. She didn't know about the others, but the pieces were there. The predator, the proximity, the silence. Now, with Sumter identified, investigators began re-examining the case from a new angle. Jane wasn't killed by someone she knew. She wasn't the victim of academic jealousy or archaeological secrets or internal vendettas. She was killed by a stranger, a man who slipped in through her window, who used the darkness as his shield, who took what he wanted, and left her lifeless on the floor of her apartment. And for almost 50 years, he remained invisible. Because he didn't fit the profile. Because he wasn't from her world. Because sometimes we look so hard for a complex motive, we miss the simple, brutal truth. She was alone. He was hunting. And no one saw it coming. On November 19th, 2018, the Middlesex District Attorney's Office held a press conference. They made the announcement the world had been waiting nearly half a century to hear. Jane Britton's case had been solved. They named Michael Sumter as the killer. They thanked the advances in DNA technology. They acknowledged the pain endured by Jane's family. And then silence. No perp walk. No court hearing. No final confrontation. Because her killer was already in the ground. Narrator quietly haunting. There would be no apologies, no explanations, no remorse. Just the hollow sound of truth, arriving too late to matter. But for Jane's surviving loved ones, the resolution still meant something. Her brother, Boyd Britton, issued a heartfelt statement. He thanked the investigators. He expressed sadness that his parents never got to see the case solved. And he ended with words that captured the weight of it all. While the pain of Jane's death never goes away, the confirmation of the identity of her killer is a significant step toward closure. Closure, a word that sounds comforting, but in truth it's complicated. Because what does closure mean when the killer is already dead? What does justice mean when it takes half a century? And what do we owe the victims of forgotten crimes? Beyond just answers, we owe them truth. We owe them visibility. And we owe them the kind of relentless pursuit that never lets their stories slip into silence. After the press conference, Harvard University issued a brief statement acknowledging the case's resolution and expressing sympathy for the Britton family. But many wondered, was that enough? For decades, the university had been the backdrop of this crime, and some argued an obstacle in its investigation. Had Harvard's obsession with image played a role in burying Jane's truth? Had the culture of secrecy allowed suspicion to cloud innocent lives while the real killer walked free? And had Jane been forgotten, not just as a victim, but as a person, a scholar, a friend, a woman whose future was stolen? Jane Britton was more than a name in a cold case file. She was brilliant, adventurous, fearless. She stood on the edge of something extraordinary, and in a single, brutal moment she was erased. But now, after 50 years, her story no longer ends with a question mark. It ends with a name, a truth, a reckoning. And maybe in that truth, we can begin to honor the echo she left behind, the echo of a life that deserved more time, more justice, and above all, more than silence. There's something cruel about silence. It doesn't scream. It doesn't weep. It simply waits. It waited in the shadows of room 19 at 6 University Road. It lingered in the archives of Harvard's administration. It cloaked the files in the Middlesex County DA's office. For nearly half a century, silence was the most persistent character in the story of Jane Britton. And now that the killer had a name, Michael Sumter, that silence, it didn't disappear. It changed shape. After the DA's 2018 press conference, the public had what it wanted. A name, a match, a resolution. But for many, it wasn't enough. Because the question remained. How did this take so long? The DNA was there. The evidence was stored. The technology existed by the early 2000s. And yet, nothing happened until 2017. Why? The deeper you dig, the more disturbing the answers become. Let's talk about Harvard, one of the most prestigious institutions in the world, home to presidents, Nobel laureates, billionaires, and also the scene of a brutal, unsolved murder. In the days following Jane's death, Harvard officials were tight-lipped. They released minimal statements. They discouraged public speculation. And they strongly resisted any suggestion that the university could have done more. But many believe Harvard's actions went far beyond standard protocol. They believe Harvard helped bury the truth. Here's what we know. In 1969, just days after the murder, police began investigating people close to Jane, her boyfriend, classmates, professors. But whispers began circulating that Harvard administration pressured police to keep the investigation quiet. The concern wasn't safety. It wasn't justice. It was reputation. A murder on Harvard's watch? That wasn't just a tragedy. It was a public relations nightmare. And for a university that thrives on prestige, image is everything. There was no campus-wide warning, no safety overhaul, no admission that a serial predator could be operating near the student body. Instead, Harvard's stance was simple. Let the police handle it. Let the media lose interest. And above all, let it fade. And fade it did. For years, Jane Britton's case was a footnote, an unsolved tragedy lost in a sea of ivy-covered walls and academic laurels. Even as DNA evidence revolutionized criminal justice, even as cold cases across the country were solved by the hundreds, Jane's case collected dust. So again, why? In 2005, investigative journalist and Harvard graduate Becky Cooper stumbled across Jane's story. She was working on a different project when someone told her, there was a student murdered in the 60s. The professor did it. And Harvard covered it up. That whisper lit a fire. Cooper began digging, interviewing former classmates, reading microfilm, accessing archived police reports. Her investigation would ultimately take years and become a basis for her critically acclaimed book, We Keep the Dead Close. Cooper discovered what many had long suspected, that the silence around Jane's murder wasn't just inertia. It was intentional. There were files Jane's family was never allowed to see, notes from early investigators that were lost. Access to Harvard administrators? Blocked. Even Jane's own academic records were sealed. It was as if Jane had been scrubbed from Harvard's narrative. A stain they were too proud to admit, a ghost they refused to acknowledge. And yet, the irony is hard to ignore. Jane Britton wasn't just a student. She loved Harvard. She was passionate about anthropology. She was immersed in the culture, the academia, the ambition. She was the daughter of an Ivy League legacy. Her father, the vice president of Radcliffe. Her mother, a socialite entrenched in Boston's elite. Jane wasn't an outsider. She was the embodiment of Harvard's ideal. And still she was discarded, left to become a ghost in the corridors of privilege. And then there's the killer Michael Sumter, a man whose crimes stretched from Cambridge to Boston. A man who was arrested 6 years after Jane's murder for a string of assaults. A man whose DNA was in the system by 2001. And yet, it took another 16 years before anyone matched him to Jane. That's not just delay. That's failure. There's a name for this kind of neglect. Institutional inertia. When systems prioritize process over people. When bureaucracy overshadows basic human urgency. When the gears of justice turn so slowly, they stop moving altogether. Michael Sumter was in the system. The evidence was in storage. The technology was available. So, why wasn't the connection made sooner? Because no one was looking. Because a young woman's murder, however brutal, wasn't seen as pressing anymore. Because once a story fades from headlines, it slips from memory. And memory is where justice either dies or begins. For Jane's surviving family, the delay was devastating. Her brother, Boyd Britton, had spent decades hoping for closure. He wrote, in 2018, "We are relieved to know who killed our sister. But it's hard not to feel bitter that it took so long. That bitterness isn't spite. It's sorrow. Sorrow that their parents went to their graves never knowing the truth. Sorrow that Jane's name was used in rumors, but not remembered in honor. Sorrow that the institutions meant to protect her, police, Harvard, the courts, let her down. So, what is Jane Britton's legacy? She was a scholar, a dreamer, a woman with her whole life ahead of her. But more than that, she is a symbol of how easily women's stories are lost, how institutions bury truth in the name of image, how silence isn't passive, it's active, and how sometimes it takes decades to hear the full story. Jane's murder may be solved, but the cost of silence remains. It cost her justice. It cost her family peace. It cost an entire academic community the chance to confront its own failures. But now her story is being told, loudly, clearly, unapologetically, in books, in documentaries, in this very video, and in every telling. We remember not just the tragedy, but the truth, because silence only wins when we stop listening. And Jane Britton, she deserves to be heard. Fade out. Somber piano music plays. Overlay text. In memory of Jane Britton, 1945 to 1969. May her voice never fade again. The title sounds like a whisper from the grave. We keep the dead close. Not just a book, not just a phrase, but a warning and a promise. Because sometimes the dead don't rest. Not when their story remains untold. Not when their justice is delayed. Not when their memory is reduced to rumor and myth. This is the final chapter of Jane Britton's story, and the beginning of something more powerful than closure, reckoning. Becky Cooper didn't know Jane Britton. They were separated by generations, by time, by tragedy, but in many ways, their worlds mirrored each other. Both were women at Harvard. Both chased knowledge with relentless intensity, and both encountered the quiet, disorienting power of being silenced. When Cooper first heard Jane's name, it was wrapped in scandal. She had an affair with a professor. He murdered her. Harvard covered it up. It was the kind of campus lore whispered late, at night, half rumor, half warning, a ghost story. But as Cooper dug deeper, she realized this wasn't just an unsolved murder. It was an institution's buried guilt, a woman's erased potential, and a society's failure to value women's lives unless they're already gone. We Keep the Dead Close became a literary excavation, a journey through old police files, dusty archives, and fading memories. It wasn't about proving conspiracy. It was about confronting silence. Cooper spent nearly a decade on her investigation. She read Jane's letters, interviewed her friends, searched the corridors of Harvard anthropology for the truth, and with every page, every clue, every whisper, Jane Britton became more than a victim. She became a mirror, reflecting how institutions twist narratives to preserve power, how women's voices are minimized, questioned, doubted, and how truth often dies in plain sight. In Jane's own journals, a vibrant, fiercely intelligent woman emerges. She was witty, curious, ambitious, slightly chaotic in the way brilliant minds often are. She wrestled with loneliness, felt the weight of perfectionism, wanted love, but not at the cost of her independence. She spoke fluent French, had traveled the world, planned to excavate ancient sites and rewrite history through anthropology. Instead, she became history. Her words, once private, now echo in Cooper's book, Fragments of a Life Stopped Too Soon. There's something romantic about ancient things, Jane once wrote. They last. They keep their secrets. How bitterly prophetic. And what of the secrets? What was Harvard hiding? Did they really suppress information? Did a professor kill Jane and get away with it? Cooper chased that theory for years. All signs pointed to one man, Dr. Lambert Karlofsky, Jane's professor. The rumors about them were pervasive. Some said they had an affair. Others believed he was obsessed. He was even interviewed by police in 1969, but he denied everything. No affair, no obsession, no involvement, and the evidence backed him up. Decades later, DNA would prove he wasn't the killer. But by then, the damage was done. His name had lived in the shadows of suspicion for nearly 50 years. And Jane? She had become a myth trapped in the narrative others built around her. Cooper's book asks the deeper question. Why are we so quick to believe the scandal? Why do we assume the woman slept her way into danger? Why do we instinctively cast suspicion on the intimate rather than the random? Because scandal sells. Because mystery intrigues. Because when a woman dies violently, the world asks, what did she do to deserve it? Jane didn't deserve it. She was in her apartment. She had locked the door. She had done everything right. And still someone got in. Someone murdered her. Someone left her body covered in blood and sprinkled with red ochre. An ancient burial rite Jane herself had studied. Was it symbolic? Was it personal? Or just the killer mocking the world she loved? To this day, no one knows. But that single detail, the red ochre, became a metaphor for Jane's legacy. She was buried in myth, entombed in speculation, and finally unearthed by someone who cared enough to ask why. We keep the dead close. It's what we do as humans. We name buildings after them. We preserve their letters. We chase justice in cold cases, even decades later. But keeping the dead close isn't just about remembering them. It's about learning from them, understanding how and why we failed them. In Jane's case, that failure was systemic. The police were under-equipped. Harvard was silent. The media was distracted. And a killer vanished into the crowd, only to reoffend again and again. Justice didn't arrive until 2018. By then, Jane's mother and father were gone. So were most of the original investigators. The cost of delay was steep and irreversible. But here's the part that matters most. Jane Britton is no longer just a victim. She's no longer a cautionary tale. She is a catalyst. Her case helped expose Harvard's culture of silence. It sparked conversations about how elite institutions protect themselves. It brought attention to cold case DNA technology, and through Cooper's book, Jane now speaks again. Her voice is in bookstores, podcasts, documentaries. This very video, she's not a mystery anymore. She's a memory with a name, a story, and a reckoning. There's something poetic about the way this story ends. Becky Cooper began her journey with a rumor. She ended it with a revolution. She didn't just write a book. She resurrected a woman. She gave voice to silence. And in doing so, she reminded the world. Truth matters, even when it's buried. Justice matters, even when it's late. And women's lives matter, even when institutions try to erase them. So yes, we do keep the dead close. Not because we're haunted, but because we owe them. We owe them our time, our questions, our fury, our truth. Jane Britton's death is no longer a secret, but her life, it's finally being honored. And as long as we tell her story, as long as we speak her name, she will never truly be gone. They said it was a cold case. They said it was forgotten. They said the truth would never surface. But time has a way of bending back, and stories, real stories, didn't stay buried forever. Jane Britton was more than a mystery. She was a daughter, a scholar, a force. And now, decades later, the silence has been broken. But her case is a chilling reminder that even in the most prestigious places, even surrounded by knowledge, power, and privilege, justice can be ignored, and danger can walk freely. If this is how one case was hidden for 50 years, how many more are still buried? Here, on Unsolved Crime Stories, we dig deeper. We bring the voices of the silence back to life. We expose what others forgot or chose to forget. If Jane's story moved you, if the truth matters to you, then make sure you subscribe, turn on the bell, and join us next time for another case they never wanted you to remember. Because every mystery has a voice. You just have to listen.